Well, it's the time of the program where I bring in my guest analyst for tonight, joining me to make sense of all you've heard. Especially the top stories is Professor Adeniyi, the Deputy Dean of the Postgraduate School at Bayes University here in Abuja. Professor Adeniyi, good to see you and thanks for your time.
Thank you, good to see you too.
You know, the fear is, people have always said something about the civil service and that is one big cabal, and both of them got to a point. Their worry is about a reform that must take place in some of the key ministries, agencies, and parastatals, because if you set out to work, there are some bottlenecks that these people, on account of some obsolete laws, will throw at you to make your job unsuccessful.
Yeah, these are fundamental questions that they raised. First of all, I commend them. The two minds were very, very fertile, no doubt. They have a very good understanding of what our problems are, coming from the economic sector. But again, we have to understand the Nigerian problem. Sometimes it just beggars belief that we have a situation where the average citizen understands what the problems are. We appreciate oftentimes that if you just tap the average person, he will tell you what our problem is, but the challenge is always the solution. And there's no sector that is immune to this, And that's why we often talk about the need for us to continue a level of reorientation, a level of sensitization, for us to have a common belief in the Nigerian entity, Nigeria as a state, or the Nigeria we want to build. How do we grow a Nigerianness in the average Nigerian? Because for now, the average person just sees permanently looking for an opportunity to get his or her own share of the national cake, however it comes, Everybody's just looking for that average opportunity. And of course, there's nobody that seems to be excluded from this chase. Sometimes looking for the one that seems to be innocent is like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Always very difficult, and that's why I'm very reluctant to speak specifically in relation to a sector like the civil service or the public service. Much as there are imperfections in that sector, you also find similar level of imperfection, even in the private sector, where you're expecting things to be a little more speak and span, because some of the things that we find in the public sector, in the civil service sector, some of the imperfections that we find there are helped by operators or operatives from the private sector. So it's a collective problem, that has to be addressed, without necessarily singling out any sector really. But again, it comes back to that old story, the often repeated story around the question of leadership. How do we, what is the mechanism for evolving our leaders, such that we now had at some point, if we could have a leader, that would drive the process of change. But that leader must be resolute, that leader must be crazy, that leader must be able to break the system, rise above the predilections, the peccadillos, of this decaying system, and bring about that monumental change, such that we will now begin to see a different kind of narrative, like you probably envision in the civil service or in the public sector. So perhaps we should just shy away from looking at just one sector. I think it's a whole thing really. There's a lethargy in all the sector, and that lethargy cannot resolve itself, but only through the prism of an individual, a leader that will drive us, and in driving us, he will drive us through the mechanism of the institutions. And the institutions will remain sustaining, to prepare the process on an overarching scale.
Let me jump in here, apologies. You watch the president, you listen to the president, and you also listen to Wale Edo and a few other ministers there. When you speak of that kind of statement, and from your ideal leader, the leadership you speak of, did you see that?
Yeah. My ideal leader. Sometimes you may say that it's utopia. It's not. It can happen in two ways. And of course, I think I've espoused on this severally, and it's common knowledge out there. It can come through happenstance or by a deliberate process. Deliberate in the sense in which, the lecturers, the populace will be concerned about electing somebody whose pedigree is special, who you think will bring about a difference. Then secondly, it can come through happenstance. You just undermine this person, but he just comes there and becomes very crazy, deploy all his tactics, and bring about that change that we're expecting. That will start hailing that person. But from the pronouncements of most of the time, our leaders say the right things. They tell us the things that we want to. Oftentimes, but there's a great disparity between what they say and what we eventually see on ground. And if you want to simplify it, you say sometimes we'll come out with policy pronouncements, but implementation is always a problem. The president, for instance, said that the ministers should go and fetch water from a dry well. Inspiring statements, very metaphorical, wonderful literary construction, but again, what about implementation? How is it going to come about? So oftentimes, after those kind of statements, you now see, an X factor bedeviling or being thrown on the path of those who are supposed to do the implementation. And that's why it can be very, very difficult to single out individuals to say, okay, it's because this one is not working well or that one is not working. There's just that X factor. But that X factor, again, is not mysterious. It rests with the individual. It's just for the individual to remain courageous and make the difference. Because in the past, we have had leaders, sections of leaders at agency level who have made a difference. And that's why up to tomorrow, we'll keep talking about El-Rufai in Abuja. Was he from heaven? He came from among us. Up to tomorrow, we still talk about Nuri Badu in the FCC. It didn't come from the sky. It came from the system. So oftentimes it just takes a determination, a resolve to make a change. And perhaps it might come this time around. We can never tell. We have just had some new ministers being sworn in now. Of course, we know that some of them are people with outstanding pedigree who could bring about change, and of course, something tells me that amongst them, we're going to see those who bring the needed change. But of course, again, in bringing about the change, we have to come to a stage where we do proper evaluation, and through those evaluations, they will hopefully pull through.
We'll come back to the M&E because they also spoke about, specifically Professor Ikechukwu spoke about synergy because he saw that some of these points raised by the president are having overlapping effect. You can't talk about food security without talking about national security. You can't talk about these without talking about climate change. You can't talk about all of this without talking about ease of doing business. So how do we ensure that there is that synergy and understanding and some sense of urgency in these minds that have been elected?
To be honest, I think at the level of ideology, the administration is starting on a very good note in terms of ideological construction. A framework is always very important, when you have some minds to achieve. But we have to be careful, in coming with these ideologies. Not just mount them. You must be ready to put them through, see to the implementation, work in accordance with your ideological prescriptions. The ideology as a whole looks like a strategy. You have to develop, minute tactics, towards the achievement of these strategies, as the case could be. The administration has come up with them through the 8-point agenda, welcome development, and perhaps, like Okechukwu said, reminding us, of the old national plan, sort of the Babangida called rolling plan. And of course, we have to also remember that the annual budget that we often do, are installments of the national plan, which you seem to have done away with. So if we're going to go back to them through this ideological construction, it looks a welcome development because it creates templates for us to measure the performance of the administration. But close to your question again is the need for us to have these central control mechanism, which I think they want to do through, or the government want to do through having a coordinating minister. A minister that will have a helicopter view, a drone-out view of what other ministries are doing, so that there can be an organized monitoring channel. If anyone is perhaps going astray, say, hold on, that's not our plan. This is our destination. Can you come back here? That kind of direction channeling can be very, very helpful, really. And we just hope that they stay on that track, as the case could be.
And the monitoring and evaluation, which they spoke about, and is there a possibility, of actually strengthening an already existing, for instance, Servicom, which we spoke about, to ensure that it does help.
Do you know, Suleiman, if you look at some of these developed countries that we often talk about, the difference between them and us is not too, in terms of the reason why they are developing. There are some intangibles that actually lead to development. You know, we're talking about team spirit, we're talking about commitment, and that's why it's not just a question of development is just not just physical, it can also be attitudinal. But in terms of attitude, there's a problem with us. But we're not showing too much concern to our attitudes. Attitude matters. Attitude towards the state, attitude towards government, it matters, you know. I haven't seen anywhere, maybe that's within the remit of the Ministry of Information. I expect them to come up with a kind of campaign, you know, for reorientation. You know, for us to have a greater level of belief in the system. President Buhari, no matter what you say, actually had this change begins with me. It was a good idea, fantastic, but it just died soon after it came up with, you know, what's Nigeria to you really? You know, attitude matters, you know, it's an intangible, but it matters. And of course, if you see the average person in the developed country, you appreciate the level of patriotism, level of nationalism. And it is that level of nationalism that will transform into their attitude to work. And it is that work that will rub off, you know, on the country's GDP. And it is that GDP that would in turn enhance their level of satisfaction as citizens of a state, you know, because they all work together. There is a continuous interaction between all these elements, and you cannot talk about anyone in isolation. But the driving force, the person controlling it at the end of the day remains the leader.
And let's see if we can close on this, and that's the environment. This is not the first time we've had the ease of doing business. We saw how much effort Okonjo-Iweala also put then during the time of President Jonathan. What kind of expectation will rejig this whole idea of making our environment, you know, flourish more because of the removal of some stoppages?
Yeah, but if I understand you very well, I think we're not doing anything right, anything wrong, really. Citizens are very resilient, they're very peaceful.
No, let me put it back again. You know, we're talking about processes. You know, sometimes some processes, there are long lines of processes that some business people go through before they can actually actualize.
Ease of doing business.
Yes.
Oh my God, very, very problematic, you know, but the average business person often regrets coming to do business in this country. I mean, even the citizens often regret it. They feel the pain, you know, because you have to, applying for a basic, bidding for jobs, for instance, you have to come in with all kinds of papers, you know, and of course, at the end of the day, you still find that these processes are circumvented. So why in the first instance are you asking us to come out with all this paper, you know? You say you are processing, you are analyzing, you are evaluating. At the end of the day, you still end up giving it to your preferred bidder, you know? So what is this cycles about, you know? I think it's just about, we have the regulation, no doubt, but again, it's implementation. And implementation cannot be done in a vacuum. It still needs the human mind, the human being. And that's why I was talking about the intangible, you know, the attitude. And that attitude will only be changed through continuous conscientization, some level of reawakening, you know, galvanize our belief, increase our belief in the Nigerian question, you know, so that at the end of the day, maybe over time, it may not happen in the immediate circumstance, but maybe in the near future, we'll begin to increase our level of belief. But that state too has to be responsible. So it's a whole lot of things. I'm not sure we can finish discussion in one day, Suleiman.
And I'm quite sure that's a fine place for us to leave it. And I'm hoping that the government will really look into national orientation, which you raised, Professor Adeniyi. Many thanks for your time as always. That's it for tonight's edition of Arise Prime Time. Do join us again tomorrow. From me and the team here in Abuja, is thank you for listening.